The morning they came to take the last of it, Dora Bellamy was already awake. She had not slept much in the weeks since the court papers arrived, and so waking before the sun had become something she no longer fought, something she simply accepted the way she had accepted most things in her 71 years, without ceremony, without complaint, with the particular quiet of a woman who had learned that the world does not pause to ask whether you are ready. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She sat at the kitchen table of the house on Hester Lane with a cup of tea she had stopped tasting an hour ago, and she listened to the neighborhood beginning to stir, the distant bark of a dog, a car engine turning over on the next block, the birds that nested in the oak by the back fence starting up their morning argument. These were the sounds she had known for 34 years. She had moved into this house at 37, newly married, with 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen things, and the particular hope that belongs only to beginnings. She had raised her daughter Patrice in this house. She had buried her husband Gerald from this house. She had painted every room at least twice and repaired the gutters herself when Gerald was gone, and grown tomatoes in the back garden every summer for 3 decades, even the summers when her back made bending difficult. Even the summers when she had more grief than she had energy, because the tomatoes were hers, and they came up whether she was ready for them or not. The house on Hester Lane was being sold. Not by her. She had not sold it. She had not agreed to sell it. She had been at her sister's in Harrisburg recovering from a hip replacement when the papers were filed, when the realtor signs went up, when the auction was scheduled. She had come home to find a notice on the door and her daughter Patrice at the kitchen table with an expression that Dora recognized immediately and wished she did not. The expression of someone who has done something they cannot entirely defend and has decided that offense is the better posture. Patrice had a power of attorney. Dora had signed it 3 years ago when she went in for a knee surgery that had seemed serious at the time, a general document. One of those things you sign because the lawyer said you should have one, and because Patrice was there and willing, and because you did not yet understand what willing could be made to mean. The house would be sold. The proceeds, Patrice had explained with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed the explanation, would go toward Dora's care. She used that word, care, the way people use words when they want the word to do the work of the justification they cannot quite make otherwise. Dora's care. As if the house on Hester Lane had not been care enough for 34 years. She had said very little during that conversation. She had listened to Patrice explain the real estate market in the county, the offers that had come in, the closing date that had been scheduled. She had listened to the numbers, the mortgage that Patrice claimed remained on the property, a mortgage Dora had no memory of, a refinancing done, without her full understanding during a period when Gerald's illness had consumed everything she had in the way of attention and oversight. She had listened. She had asked 3 questions. She had received answers that were technically responsive and practically evasive. She had gone to bed and stared at the ceiling and understood, in the way you understand things that you have perhaps known for some time and have been choosing not to examine directly, that she was going to lose this house. The movers arrived at 8 in the morning with a truck that was too large for Hester Lane and blocked the street for the better part of 2 hours, which gave the neighbors something to watch from their porches, which they did, with the particular quality of neighbors who are sympathetic but not quite sympathetic enough to intervene. Dora had packed what was hers into 8 boxes and 4 suitcases. The furniture, most of it, would stay for the new owners. Patrice had arranged this. The dining table Gerald had built in the garage the winter before their daughter was born. The bookshelves he had constructed along the living room wall, built in, floor to ceiling, still holding 30 years of reading. Dora had taken the books. She had not taken the shelves because you cannot take a built-in shelf, and she had stood in the living room for a long time looking at the bare wood where the books had been and had felt the particular grief of watching a thing become an absence. She had one letter in her coat pocket that she had been carrying for 6 days. It had come from the county assessor's office in response to an inquiry she had made 3 weeks earlier, when she had first understood what Patrice had done and had begun, quietly and without telling anyone, to do what she had always done when confronted with a problem. She had started looking for information. The letter confirmed what the inquiry had turned up. A property in her name. Not Gerald's name, not a shared name, not any name she had expected to find. Her name, Dora May Bellamy. listed as the sole owner of a parcel of land and the structure upon it located at the end of Tabor Road in Cullen County, 6 miles outside the town of Greer, North Carolina. The property had been in her name for 43 years. She had never been to it. She had not known it existed. The property had come from her mother. Her mother, Viola, had died when Dora was 28, quickly and without warning. A stroke on a Tuesday morning in March that had left no time for the kind of conversations that people put off because they believe there will be more time. Dora had settled the small estate with her sister, a modest savings account, the furniture from the apartment, the costume jewelry, and the Goodwill coat. There had been nothing in the estate documents about property, nothing about land, nothing about a parcel 6 miles outside Greer in a county Dora had not set foot in since she was a child visiting her mother's relatives. She had not known to look. She had been 28 and grief-stricken and trusting that what the lawyer told her was complete. The parcel had sat in her name for 43 years, property taxes paid by a mechanism she did not yet understand, listed on the county rolls without anyone to claim it, waiting. She had the letter and a key. The key had been in her mother's jewelry box, a small flat key on a plain ring, unlabeled. Dora had kept the jewelry box for 43 years, moving it from apartment to house, carrying it through every transition of her life because it had been Viola's and because she could not quite bring herself to sort through it with the finality that sorting through it would have required. She knew everything in the box. She had opened it and looked at it many times over the years. But she had never, until the assessor's letter arrived, looked at the key with the attention it deserved. She put the key in her coat pocket beside the letter. She took the 8 boxes and 4 suitcases to her sister Margaret's house in Harrisburg, where Margaret had said she could stay for as long as she needed in the guest room. Margaret was the kind of sister who meant what she said and who had never in 68 years of sisterhood said anything she did not mean, which was one of the great constants of Dora's life and the reason she drove to Harrisburg without calling ahead. She knew she would be let in. She knew she would be fed and not asked too many questions in the first night. She knew Margaret would make her a proper cup of tea and sit across the kitchen table with the expression of someone who is present and listening, which was what Dora needed before she needed anything else. She stayed at Margaret's for 2 weeks. She did not tell Margaret about the letter from the assessor's office for the first 4 days. She needed to understand it herself before she could explain it to anyone, and understanding it required sitting with it in the way she sat with difficult things, quietly, without rushing toward conclusions, letting the information settle and rearrange itself into something she could see clearly. The property records she requested from Cullen County confirmed the assessor's letter. The parcel at the end of Tabor Road had come into her mother's possession in 1951 and had been transferred to Dora's name in the estate settlement of 1982, documented in the probate records of Cullen County, a document that had apparently been filed without Dora's awareness, possibly by a different lawyer than the one she had worked with in Harrisburg, possibly in the confusion of administering an estate across 2 counties. She could not entirely reconstruct how it had happened. What she could confirm was that it had. She paid for an online search service that told her the structure on the parcel was described as a wood-frame shed, single room, built approximately 1940, assessed at $4. She had read this several times. $4. She had shown this to Margaret on the 5th day over the kitchen table. Margaret had looked at it for a long moment with her reading glasses, and then had looked at Dora with the expression she had always had when confronting a piece of information that was stranger than expected. "Your mother never said anything," Margaret said. "Not to me," Dora said. "Not to me either." Margaret turned the paper over as if there might be something on the back. $4. "The assessment," Dora said. "What it's worth, according to the county." "Well," Margaret said, "the county has been wrong before." Dora had smiled at this. It was the first time she had smiled in 2 weeks. She drove to Greer on a Thursday in October when the mountains had gone their best colors, the kind of October day that the southern Appalachians produced with the particular generosity of a landscape that understands it is performing and intends to do it well. She had driven the route the night before on the map application on her phone, noting where the paved road turned to gravel and where the gravel turned to something the map indicated as a track. She had borrowed Margaret's old Subaru, which had better clearance than her own sedan and which Margaret had handed over without hesitation along with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in foil and the instruction to call when she arrived somewhere she had signaled. Greer was a town of 4,000 people in the western foothills of North Carolina, the kind of town that had once had more than 4,000 people and remembered this. The downtown had the specific quality of a place adjusting to the gap between what it had been and what it currently was, some storefronts occupied and some not. The hardware store doing what hardware stores do in small towns, the diner doing what diners do, the library open on reduced hours. She stopped at the diner for the coffee, and because she had the instinct, developed over 71 years, that diners in small towns are where you go when you want to know something about a place. The woman behind the counter was 60 or so, with the contained efficiency of someone who had been doing this specific job for a very long time and had organized herself around its requirements. Dora asked for coffee and, after a moment, asked whether she knew Tabor Road. The woman looked at her with the direct assessment of someone not accustomed to strangers asking about specific roads. "Know of it," she said. "Not much out there. It dead ends in the hills. There's an old place at the end, been there since before I was born. Belongs to somebody, I suppose, but nobody's ever done anything with it." She set the coffee down. "You looking to buy out that way?" "I might own it," Doris said. The woman regarded her with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived somewhere adjacent to skepticism. "The old shed? If that's what it is. People around here have been calling it the Viola place," the woman said. "For the woman who used to come around, years ago. Haven't seen anyone out there in decades." Doris set down her coffee cup. "Viola was my mother." There was a pause in the diner of the particular kind that happens when something unexpected shifts the quality of a conversation. "Well," the woman said, after a moment, with a different expression than the one she'd had before. "I suppose you'd better go take a look then." Tabor Road turned off the county highway 7 miles outside of Greer and climbed into the hills through mixed hardwood forest that had gone gold and orange and the specific deep red of sourwood in October. The paved road lasted for 2 miles and then became the gravel track the map had indicated, and the gravel track lasted for another mile before becoming something that was neither gravel nor track, but the approximate path that a vehicle could manage if it committed. The Subaru managed. Margaret had not been wrong about the clearance. She drove slowly, watching the forest close around the track, watching the light change as the canopy thickened. October light in the southern Appalachians has a particular quality at midday, golden and specific, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look as if they have been selected for. The leaves came down in the wind, yellow and red, crossing the track in the slow diagonal of leaves that have finally let go. The track ended in a small clearing. She stopped the car and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at what was in front of her. It was a shed, not a barn, not a cabin, not anything that could be generously described as a structure of consequence. It was a single-room wood-frame shed, perhaps 12 feet by 16, built from planks that had weathered to the particular gray of wood that has spent decades in the rain and the mountain air without treatment or maintenance. The roof was tin, and the tin had rusted to the deep orange red of old iron, and some of the tin had shifted at the edges where the nails had let go, but the roof appeared, from where she sat, to be largely present. The door was wood, hung on iron hinges, and it was closed. There was no window on the side she could see from the track. There was a growth of blackberry around the base of the structure on 2 sides, dense and impenetrable looking, and a tulip poplar had come up within 10 feet of the northeast corner and grown to a considerable size, its roots presumably having had decades to establish themselves. She sat in the car for a long time. She thought about the town of Greer and the diner and the woman who had said the county had assessed it at a figure that would not buy you a decent meal. She thought about Patrice, who had taken the house on Hester Lane with a power of attorney and a refinancing document, and the particular confidence of someone who has decided that their parents' future is a problem they have the right to solve on their parents' behalf. She thought about what Patrice would say if she could see what Dora was looking at. She could hear it clearly enough. She had been hearing Patrice's voice in her head for 6 days, the way you hear the voices of people who have recently surprised you with what they are capable of, the way the surprise keeps replaying. Patrice would say, "Mom, look at it." She would say it the way she said things she considered obvious. She would say, "There's nothing there." She would say, "You drove 4 hours for this." Dora got out of the car. The clearing was quiet with the specific quiet of a place that does not receive visitors. The leaves underfoot were deep, years of accumulation, soft and soundless. The blackberry along the shed's base had thorns that caught at her coat when she came around the side, and she moved carefully, the way she moved most things now that her hip had been replaced and her back required negotiation. The tulip poplar had dropped its leaves, and they lay around the base of the tree in a yellow circle. A crow in the upper branches of a beech at the edge of the clearing watched her with the focused attention of crows, which is considerable. She stood at the door. The door had a latch of iron, simple and functional, the kind that lifts and swings. She lifted it. The door swung outward, the hinges protesting with the sustained creak of iron that has not moved in a long time, and she stood in the opening and looked in. The smell was the first thing. Old wood, dry despite the years, and something underneath the wood smell, something she could not immediately name, something faintly sweet and faintly mineral, the smell of a space that has been closed for a very long time, and that has developed its own specific atmosphere inside that closure. The interior was dim, the single door providing the only light. She took out her phone and turned on the flashlight. What the light found stopped her. She had expected empty. She had expected the interior of a shed that had been closed for decades, which is to say she had expected dirt and rot and the evidence of animal habitation and the general disintegration that time visits upon structures left to themselves. She had expected nothing worth looking at closely. The shed was not empty. Along the left wall, on a workbench constructed of heavy planks supported by sawhorses, were tools. Not rusted, not deteriorated beyond recognition, but protected, wrapped individually in cloth that had browned with age but had done its work, each tool laid out in the specific organization of someone who valued what they owned and expected to return to it. She could see, beneath the cloth wrappings, the shapes of the handles, the familiar profiles of handheld tools, the kind of tools that belonged to someone who worked with their hands in the serious way of a previous era. On the right wall, hung on pegs of the kind that Gerald had always said were the correct way to hang tools, were larger implements. A handsaw, two planes, what appeared to be a brace and bit. These were unwrapped and had been touched by the air of the decades, but they were iron and steel, and they had been well made, and they were still, despite everything, present. In the center of the floor, covered by a canvas tarpaulin that had stiffened with age but had not rotted, was something larger. She could not tell what it was beneath the canvas. The shape suggested a piece of furniture, something with legs, something of moderate height. And on the workbench, between two of the cloth-wrapped tools, was an envelope. Dora crossed to the workbench. The floor planks were solid beneath her feet, not soft, not yielding, the floor of a structure that had been built with the intention that it would last. She picked up the envelope. It was addressed, in handwriting she recognized immediately and completely, to Dora. Her mother's handwriting. She had known her mother's handwriting for as long as she had known how to read. The looping D, the particular way Viola formed the letter R. She stood in the dim interior of the shed with the flashlight from her phone casting its narrow light, and held the envelope in both hands, and did not open it immediately, because opening it immediately would have been rushing, and this was not a moment to rush. She stood for a long time. She thought about her mother at 28, which was how old Viola had been when Dora was born, and about all the years between that beginning and the March Tuesday when Viola had died, about the 43 years since that Tuesday, about the box on Dora's phone screen that said the assessed value of this property was $4, about the woman in the diner who had said the county has been wrong before. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages, written on the stationery her mother had always used, the pale blue paper with the small spray of violets in the upper left corner that Dora associated with birthday letters and Christmas notes, and the occasional serious correspondence that Viola had conducted in the formal way of her generation. The ink had faded to a warm brown, but the handwriting was perfectly legible. Her mother had known she was dying. Not in March, not the stroke, but earlier. Dora understood as she read, a diagnosis of heart trouble that Viola had received and had decided to manage privately, in the way she managed most things, without making her difficulty the burden of the people she loved. She had known for nearly a year before the stroke. She had spent that year, among other things, writing this letter. She wrote about the shed and about the land it stood on. She wrote about Dora's grandfather, her own father, a man named Clarence who had been a furniture maker in the old way, before factory production made the old way economically untenable, and who had built the shed in 1940 as a workshop and had worked in it for 20 years producing the kind of furniture that people now, Viola wrote, paid serious money to acquire at auction. She had inherited the land from Clarence, along with the tools and the workshop and several pieces of furniture that Clarence had built and that Viola had stored in the shed under the canvas tarpaulin, covered and protected, because she had not known what else to do with them, and because she had understood, in the way of someone who has a feeling about the future without being able to explain it precisely, that they should be kept. Viola wrote about why she had not told Dora about the property while she was alive. She had intended to. She had been waiting for the right moment, which is the kind of waiting that can go on indefinitely, and did. And by the time the diagnosis arrived and she understood that the right moment had become the last moment, she had decided to write instead, to write as honestly as she could about what the property was and what the tools were and what she hoped Dora would make of it, because she could not know, but she could hope. She wrote about Clarence's furniture. She wrote that in her estimation, based on what she had learned in the years since his death, the pieces in the shed were worth considerably more than anyone had told her, that the tools were of a quality no longer manufactured, that the wood in some of the pieces was walnut and cherry from trees that had grown on this land and been milled by Clarence himself on a mill that had long since been dismantled. She wrote this carefully, not with the enthusiasm of someone overstating a case, but with the measured precision of someone who has done their research and wants to be accurate. She wrote that she was sorry she had waited too long. She wrote it directly, without softening it, in the way of people who have run out of time for softening. She wrote, "I waited for the right moment, and the right moment ran out. Don't do what I did. Don't wait." She ended the letter with something that Dora read 3 times before she folded the pages back along their original creases. Viola had written, "You were always the one who could make something from very little. I believed that about you when you were 7 years old, and I still believe it. The tools are good. The wood is good. What's under the canvas is the best piece your grandfather ever made. Use them, sell them, do what you need to do. But don't let anyone tell you what something is worth before you've opened it up and looked for yourself." Dora folded the letter and held it. The crow in the beech tree called once, a flat declarative sound in the October quiet. She crossed to the canvas tarpaulin in the center of the floor. She lifted it from one corner, working it carefully, the stiff fabric, releasing its grip on itself reluctantly, and folded it back to reveal what her grandfather Clarence had built and what her mother had stored here and what had been waiting in this shed for 43 years. It was a chest, not a simple chest, not a utilitarian box, but a piece of furniture made with the full skill of a craftsman who understood that a chest could also be a statement, a proof, a demonstration of what hands and patience and good wood were capable of. It was walnut, the grain running in the particular direction that walnut grain runs when someone has chosen the board with the attention of a person who knows what they are looking for, and it had been finished with something that had preserved it beyond what the decades should have allowed. The surface still carrying its depth, the corners still crisp, the dovetails still tight. It sat on 4 legs of turned walnut, the turnings clean and balanced, and it had a lid with a large brass hinge of the kind that moved with a deliberate smoothness, the kind of hardware made in an era when hardware was made to last. She opened the lid. Inside, nested in the cedar lining that had kept them from the damp and the time, were the things her grandfather had placed there. A set of carving chisels in a leather roll, each one sharp, each one balanced, each one the work of a Sheffield maker whose name she could read on the handles, tools of such quality that they had remained sharp for 6 decades in a cedar chest in a locked shed at the end of a mountain track. A small notebook, hand-bound in leather, filled in pencil with the drawings and measurements of furniture pieces, the working notes of a craftsman developing designs, each page covered in the precise sketches of a man for whom precision was a form of respect for the material. A letter, addressed to whoever opens this chest, in handwriting she did not recognize. And at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in what had once been a piece of linen, a small framed photograph. 2 people, a man and a woman, standing in the clearing outside this shed, the shed visible behind them. The man was holding a piece of furniture she recognized as the chest, and he was smiling with the particular smile of someone who has just completed something they are proud of. The woman beside him was young and direct-eyed, and Dora recognized her immediately. Her mother, Viola, at perhaps 20 years old, standing in this clearing with her father, the year the chest was built. Dora sat down on the floor of the shed with the photograph in her hands and the October light coming through the open door and the smell of cedar and old walnut around her, and she sat for a long time. She did not weep immediately. She was a woman who had learned to hold things before she released them, who had spent 71 years developing the particular patience of someone who understands that the first response is not always the true one. But she held the photograph carefully, the way you hold something that is the proof of something you had not known to look for. The photograph of her mother at 20 and her grandfather she had never met standing in the clearing outside the shed that had been waiting for her for 43 years, and she felt the specific weight of it. The weight of the distance between the woman she had been looking at all her life in older photographs and this young woman who had stood in this clearing with her father and had known already, perhaps, or suspected, that this place would matter to someone someday. Outside, the wind moved the trees, and the leaves came down in the October light, and the crow called again from the beach. She stayed in the shed for 2 hours. She unwrapped the tools on the workbench carefully, each one, and laid them out in the light from the doorway. There were 43 tools, each wrapped individually, each as her grandfather had left them. A set of bench chisels, 2 spoke shaves, for carving gouges, 3 marking gauges, a shoulder plane of the kind that she would come to learn was no longer manufactured and had not been for 50 years, a joinery mallet of applewood, the head still tight on the handle, the striking face worn with use to the particular smoothness of a tool that has been handled thousands of times. She lifted the furniture under the tarpaulin, piece by piece. 4 pieces in all, each covered individually. A side table in cherry. A blanket chest smaller than the walnut one, in maple. 2 matching chairs, their joints still tight, their surfaces still holding their finish. She found, in the back corner of the shed behind the workbench, stacked flat and wrapped in waxed canvas, 3 boards of figured walnut, 2 inches thick, air-dried, the grain running in the particular pattern that woodworkers called crotch figure, the swirling, impossible grain that comes from the junction of a tree's trunk and a major limb. These boards were extraordinary. She did not know enough yet to know how extraordinary, but she knew enough to understand that this was the kind of wood that people who cared about would care about. She sat in the doorway of the shed as the light began its afternoon lean and read the letter from her grandfather's chest. It had been written by Clarence himself, dated 1968, 18 years before he died and 22 years before Dora knew she existed. He wrote to whoever you are, which told her he had not known who would eventually find the chest, only that someone would. He wrote about the tools and about the furniture and about the wood, with the specific practical knowledge of a man who had spent his life working with these things. He wrote about where the walnut had come from and what the figured boards were worth and what they could be used for. He wrote it without sentimentality and without performance, in the way of someone for whom these things were simply facts that deserved to be communicated clearly. He wrote at the end, "These things are worth more than what people will tell you. Don't let anyone look at the outside of something and tell you what's inside." She drove back to Greer in the late afternoon. She stopped at the diner. The same woman was behind the counter, end of her shift by the look of it, untying her apron. "Well," the woman said, when she saw Dora. "What did you find?" Dora thought about how to answer this. "More than I expected," she said. The woman nodded slowly. "People usually do," she said, "when they finally go look." That evening in the parking lot of the motel outside Greer where she had taken a room for the night, Dora called Margaret. She told her about the shed and the tools and the furniture and the letter from their mother and the photograph of Viola at 20 and the letter from Clarence and the figured walnut boards in the back corner and the chisel set in the leather roll and the notebook full of drawings. Margaret was quiet for a long time when Dora finished. "For dollars," Margaret said finally. "That's what the county said." Another pause. "Dora," Margaret said, "what are you going to do?" Dora looked out through the windshield at the October dark, at the hills she could just make out against the lighter dark of the sky, the hills that had the shed at the end of Tabor Road at the top of them. "I'm going to go back," she said. "I'm going to go back and figure out what I have." She paused. "And then," she said, "I'm going to build something." She heard Margaret's breath on the line, the specific quality of her sister's breath when she was moved by something and was not going to say so directly. "Okay," Margaret said after a moment. "Then I'll come help." Dora sat in the dark parking lot for a long time after she hung up the phone. She thought about the house on Hester Lane. which had sold at closing for a number she knew and which was no longer hers. She thought about Patrice and the power of attorney and the word care used in the way it had been used, as a container for something that was not quite its meaning. She thought about the dining table Gerald had built and the bookshelves along the living room wall and the tomatoes in the back garden and the 34 years of a life she had made in a house she had not been permitted to keep. She thought about her grandfather Clarence, whom she had never met, who had built a chest of figured walnut and filled it with the best chisels he owned and a notebook of his drawings and a letter to a stranger he would never meet, and had locked it in a shed at the end of a mountain track, trusting that the right person would find their way there eventually. She thought about her mother Viola, who had kept the key for decades and then passed it on without explanation, leaving it in a jewelry box with the costume jewelry and the Goodwill coat, trusting that Dora would eventually open the box with enough attention to understand what she was holding. She thought about herself at 7 years old, which was the age her mother had written about, the age at which Viola had believed something about her that she had apparently still believed when she was writing in a hospital room 43 years later, which was that Dora was the one who could make something from very little. She had been stripped of the house she had lived in for 34 years. She had been maneuvered out of the place she had made her home by the person she had trusted with the authority to protect it. But she had a key that had been waiting in a jewelry box for 43 years. She had a shed at the end of a mountain track that the county assessed at $4, and that contained the tools of a craftsman and the furniture of a craftsman and the wood of a craftsman and 2 letters from people who had loved her before she was old enough to lose them. She had more than she had thought she had this morning. She started the car and drove back to the motel and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. She went back on a Monday. Not the Monday after. Not the following week. Not after a careful plan had been assembled and a budget prepared and the kind of organized approach that other people would have counseled. She went back the Monday after the night in the Greer motel parking lot, because she had slept well and woken clear, and because she understood, in the way she had begun to understand things in the weeks since the house on Hester Lane was taken, that waiting for the conditions to be right was a different thing from waiting for herself to be ready, and she was ready. She drove back to Harrisburg first and packed a larger bag. She told Margaret she was going, and Margaret said she would come on Friday. Dora said there was no guest room. There was in fact no room of any kind. There was a shed, and Margaret said she had slept in worse and would bring an air mattress and her good rain jacket and the Dutch oven she used for camping, which covered most of what you needed for roughing it, as long as you had a fire. Dora drove back to Greer on a Monday in late October with 1 large bag and a box of basic supplies, and Gerald's old Coleman lantern that had been in the 8 boxes she had packed from the house on Hester Lane, because she had not known why she was keeping it, and now she did. She stopped at the hardware store in Greer. The man behind the counter was perhaps 65, built with the particular solidity of someone who has spent decades lifting things, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the expression of a man who is genuinely interested in what you need and why. She told him she had a property at the end of Tabor Road and was going to be spending some time there and needed to understand what she would require for basic habitation of a structure that had been closed for 43 years. He looked at her with the direct assessment she was beginning to recognize as a Greer quality, the particular way people in small mountain towns looked at you when they were deciding what you were made of. The old Viola place, he said. She had not told him the name. My mother, she said. He took off his reading glasses from his forehead and set them on the counter. You're Viola's daughter, Dora Bellamy. He extended his hand. Ray Cutler. I knew your mother. She came through Greer a few times when I was young, coming to check on the property. Quiet woman. Knew exactly what she needed. He paused. Been a long time since anyone went up that road. I know, Dora said. He helped her for 45 minutes. Moving through the hardware store with the purposeful knowledge of someone who had been in the same building for 30 years and knew where everything was, including the things that weren't on the shelf. He told her what the roof would need if the tin had shifted, which sealer worked best on aged wood in a mountain climate, how to assess whether a floor joist had softened without taking the floor up. He told her these things with the direct practicality of someone who assumes you can hear and understand what he's telling you, which she appreciated without saying so. She drove up Tabor Road in the late morning. The track was different in the day than it had been in the late afternoon of her first visit, the light coming through the hardwoods at a different angle, the colors of the October canopy more visible, the birch trees along the lower section burning their particular clear yellow. She drove slowly because the track required it, and because she was not in a hurry, because she had decided on the drive from Harrisburg that hurrying was one of the things she was finished with. She parked in the clearing and sat in the car for a moment. The shed was as she had left it, the door closed, the blackberry along the base, the tulip poplar in the northeast corner, the tin roof catching the morning light. It was a small structure. It was an unimpressive structure. It was, by every measure the county had applied to it, a $4 structure. She got out of the car and opened the door and went to work. The first week was assessment. She moved through the shed the way she had learned to move through difficult things, methodically, without skipping ahead to the parts that interested her most, doing the unglamorous necessary work first, so that she understood what she actually had before she decided what to do with it. She tested every floor plank. She examined every wall section. She got on the car roof to look at the tin roof from close range, noting where the nails had backed out and where the tin had lifted and where the sealant along the ridge had cracked away. She found, in the process of this examination, that the shed was sounder than it appeared from the outside, which was the shed's particular quality. She was coming to understand the quality of something that looks like less than it is. The walls were tight. The framing was old-growth pine, the tight-grained dense pine that was cut before the forests were managed for fast growth, and it had dried to a hardness that modern lumber did not achieve. The floor joists were the same material and were solid. The roof needed work, but the decking beneath the tin was intact. The structure was, by the judgment of a woman who had spent 34 years maintaining a house on her own after Gerald died, and who had learned the vocabulary of structures through necessity, basically sound. She bought the materials Ray Cutler had recommended and drove them up the track in 2 loads. She renailed the tin roof from the car roof using a hammer and ring shank nails. She sealed the ridge. She weatherproofed the siding with the product Ray had recommended, working section by section with a brush in the cool October afternoons, the smell of the sealer sharp in the mountain air. She repaired the door hinge, which had been pulling slightly from the frame, using the screws and the wood hardener from the hardware store kit. She swept the floor. This took most of a morning because the floor had 43 years of accumulation that required patience rather than force, and because she was careful around the workbench and the tool storage and the furniture pieces, moving each thing gently to clean beneath it. She discovered in the process of sweeping that the floor planks, which she had assessed as sound, were also beautiful, the same tight-grained old pine as the framing, worn smooth by whatever use the shed had seen in the years Clarence had worked in it, the kind of floor that had earned its quality through decades of honest contact with a craftsman's boots. She washed the floor with Murphy's oil soap diluted in warm water from the 5-gallon jug she had brought from Greer, working on her knees with a cloth, section by section, the way her mother had always washed a floor. The pine came up to a warm honey tone as it dried. She moved the lantern to the center of the shed and sat on the floor and looked at what she had. The furniture pieces, uncovered now and standing in the clean space, were extraordinary. She had understood this on her first visit, but had been too overwhelmed to look carefully, and now she looked carefully. The walnut chest was the centerpiece, the piece her grandfather had been holding in the photograph, and it was the kind of object that announced itself without trying. The proportions were exact in the way that hand-built furniture from a true craftsman is exact, not the mechanical exactness of a machine, but the deeper exactness of something built by a person who understood what they were building and why each dimension mattered. The dovetails at the corners were cut by hand. She could see the slight variations that hand-cut dovetails always had, each one its own, each one fitting its partner precisely. The lid moved on its brass hinge with a smoothness that 43 years in a cedar-lined chest had not diminished. The side table in cherry was smaller, but no less considered. The grain of the cherry had been selected for the way it moved through the piece, the figure running in a continuous flow from the top surface down through the legs, which meant Clarence had understood the board before he cut it and had planned the piece around what the wood already contained. This was the kind of furniture that people who understood furniture paid serious attention to. She photographed everything with her phone, moving around each piece in the way she had seen photographs taken in the auction catalogs that Gerald had occasionally received, from the front and the side and the back and close in on the details, the dovetails, the turning on the chest's legs, the way the cherry figure moved through the table. She photographed the tools. She photographed the figured walnut boards. She photographed the notebook with its pages of drawings. Then she sat on the floor of the clean shed with Gerald's Coleman lantern burning beside her, and she called Margaret. "How bad is it?" Margaret said. "It's not bad," Dora said. "Margaret, come Friday. Bring the Dutch oven." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Margaret arrived on Friday afternoon with the air mattress and the Dutch oven and a bag of groceries that represented her interpretation of what two women needed for a weekend of serious work in the mountains, which was considerable and accurate. She stood in the clearing and looked at the shed for a moment, and then looked at Dora. "You fixed the roof," she said. "Needed doing." Margaret walked to the door and looked in. She was quiet for a long time. She moved to the walnut chest and bent to examine the dovetails in the particular close-up way that Margaret examined things she wanted to understand fully, and then she straightened and looked at Dora. "Daddy used to talk about a man who made furniture like this," she said. "Before our time. He'd seen a piece once at someone's house, said he'd never seen joinery like it." "Clarence," Dora said. Our grandfather." "Our grandfather." Margaret looked around the shed. She looked at the tools on the workbench and the boards in the back corner and the photograph on the wall where Dora had tacked it, Viola at 20 in the clearing, the chest between her and her father. "Mom knew about all of this," Margaret said. "She knew. She was waiting for the right time to tell us." Margaret was quiet. Then she said, with the directness that was Margaret's particular gift, "Well, she ran out of time. So now we don't." They worked through the weekend, the two of them, in the way of sisters who have worked together before and who have developed over decades the particular efficiency of people who know each other's pace and rhythm. Margaret was better with the physical work than Dora, her back sounder, her knees not recently replaced, and she took on the tasks that required sustained bending and lifting while Dora managed the detail work and the research. Dora had printed, before leaving Harrisburg, the 7 pages of notes she had compiled from online searches about her grandfather's tools, his furniture, the Sheffield chisel makers, the figured walnut markets, the auction records for hand-built American furniture from the mid-20th century. The figures she had found in the auction records had made her sit very still at Margaret's kitchen table for several minutes before she had gone to make herself another cup of tea. She had not shared these figures with anyone yet. She had wanted to be in the shed with Margaret before she said them out loud, because they were the kind of figures that required the shed around you to make sense of, the kind that were abstract on a screen and concrete only in the presence of the things they described. On Saturday evening, they made a fire outside the shed, the first fire in the old stone ring she had found at the edge of the clearing, still there from whenever Clarence had last used it, and they sat beside it in the camp chairs Margaret had thought to bring and ate the stew she had made in the Dutch oven and watched the dark come down over the mountains and the stars emerge in the particular density they had at this elevation. Dora said, "I looked up what this furniture sells for." Margaret looked at her across the fire. "The walnut chest. A piece of comparable quality, comparable maker, comparable period. I found 3 auction records. The lowest was $9,000. The highest was $22,000. Margaret set down her stew. "The cherry table. 2 auction records for comparable pieces. $11,000 and $14,000. Margaret said nothing. "The figured walnut boards in the back corner. I found a specialty lumber dealer in Asheville who posts prices online. Boards of that figure and that thickness and that width are selling for between $80 and $120 per board foot. I estimated the board feet in those 3 boards at approximately 40. Margaret calculated this without a calculator because Margaret had always been quick with numbers. Her expression did not change, but her eyes did. "The chisel set in the leather roll," Dora said. "Sheffield makers from that period, that quality, complete sets in that condition. Between $800 and $1,200 for the set." "Dora," Margaret said. "The notebook of drawings," Dora said. "I don't know yet. It may have value as a document to the right collector or museum. Or it may be most valuable as a working document if I use the designs to make something." Margaret set her bowl on the ground beside her chair. "If you use the designs." "Clarence was a furniture maker," Dora said. "He left the tools. He left the wood. He left the drawings. He left a letter that told whoever found it what the materials were worth." She paused. "I think he wasn't only leaving me an inheritance. I think he was leaving me a direction." The fire crackled between them. The October dark was complete now. No light visible from Greer at this elevation. Only the fire and the stars and the shapes of the mountains against the sky. "You don't know how to make furniture," Margaret said. This was not a challenge. It was the kind of observation that Margaret made when she wanted the full picture rather than the edited one. "I know how to learn things," Dora said. "I learned how to fix gutters at 45. I learned how to replace a bathroom subfloor at 52. I learned how to navigate a probate court at 71. She looked at the fire. "I have the tools. I have the drawings. I have the wood. And I have time." Margaret picked up her bowl. She ate for a moment in the way of someone thinking without needing to narrate the thinking. "We should get the furniture appraised," she said. "Properly. By someone who knows." "Yes," Doris said. "I have a name from one of the auction house websites. A specialist in American vernacular furniture who is based in Asheville. I'm going to call on Monday." "And the shed," Margaret said. "You can't live in a shed, Dora." "Not yet," Doris said. "But I own 2 acres. The shed is on 2 acres at the end of a mountain track in October in western North Carolina." She looked at her sister across the fire. "Margaret, have you seen what land like this sells for?" Margaret looked at her. "I'm not selling it," Doris said. "I'm telling you what it's worth. I'm telling you that what the county has assessed at $4 is not $4. They were quiet together for a while, the fire doing what fires do in the mountains in October, which is everything necessary. The appraiser's name was Helen Marsh, and she drove up from Asheville on the following Wednesday in a truck that had the clearance for Tabor Road, and that she drove with the confidence of someone who had been on worse roads in pursuit of furniture worth appraising. She was perhaps 55, with the particular focused energy of someone who has spent her career in the presence of objects that reward close attention and who has developed, over that career, an attention that was itself remarkable. She stood in the doorway of the shed for a moment before she came in. "Who built these?" she said. "My grandfather, Clarence Beaumont. He worked out of this shed from approximately 1940 to 1960. She moved to the walnut chest. She crouched to examine the dovetails. She opened the lid and looked at the hinge and the cedar lining and the way the lid sat when open, the balance of it. She turned the chest slightly to look at the back, which was finished with the same care as the front, which was not always the case with furniture from any era and which told her something specific. She moved to the cherry table. She lifted it, turned it upside down, looked at the underside construction, the way the top was attached to the base, the method Clarence had used for allowing the wood to move with seasonal changes, a method she identified aloud as a specific technique with a name Dora did not recognize, but which Helen said indicated that Clarence had learned from someone who knew the old methods. She looked at the maple blanket chest. She looked at the 2 chairs. She sat in one of the chairs and moved in it deliberately, testing the joints. She looked at the figured walnut boards for a long time. She looked at the tools without touching them, bending close over the workbench with a small flashlight she had brought, reading the maker's marks on the plain bodies, the chisel tangs, the handles of the spoke shaves. She read the notebook of drawings, turning the pages slowly, with the attention of someone reading a text in a language they love. She looked at the photograph on the wall. Then she stood in the center of the shed and was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said, "I need you to understand something before I give you my assessment." Dora said she was listening. "Furniture like this does not often survive," Helen said. "It survives in museums sometimes, in private collections sometimes, rarely in the place where it was made in the condition in which it was made. The combination of the tools and the furniture and the working drawings and the materials, as a body of work representing a single craftsman, is genuinely unusual. It is not priceless, nothing is priceless, but it is considerably more than $4. She named figures. She was precise about them, drawing the line between what she could confirm from auction comparables and what was her professional judgment in the absence of direct comparison, and she was careful to distinguish between replacement value and likely sale value and the specific premium that provenance added when provenance was well documented. Dora listened to the figures without interrupting. When Helen finished, she said, "The notebook, the photograph, the letters." Helen looked at her steadily. "The documentation makes everything more valuable. A piece of furniture with a known maker and a documented history is not the same object, in the market's eyes, as the same piece of furniture without that history. Your grandfather left you the evidence, as well as the furniture." She paused. He knew what he was doing. Dora thought about the letter in the chest. Don't let anyone look at the outside of something and tell you what's inside. He did, she said. Helen drove back down to Greer, and Dora sat in the shed in the afternoon light and did the arithmetic that Helen's figures made possible. The furniture, sold at auction with full documentation, would yield enough to make a serious start on whatever came next. Not a fortune, not the kind of number that ended all concerns, but the kind of number that opened doors that had been closed. The land itself, 2 acres at the end of a mountain track in a county where people from the cities were increasingly looking for exactly this, was worth considerably. More than the county's assessment suggested. She had looked at comparable sales. She was not poor. She had been made to feel poor. She had been maneuvered out of the house she had occupied for 34 years with a document she had signed in good faith, and a refinancing she had not understood and a power of attorney used for a purpose she had not authorized. She had been left with 8 boxes and 4 suitcases, and the particular shame that comes when someone close to you treats your life as an asset to be managed. But she was not poor. She had a $4 shed on 2 acres in the mountains, and the shed contained her grandfather's life's work and her mother's faith in her, and 2 letters from people who had loved her before she was old enough to know she needed them. She began to plan. Not the way she had planned things in the years of the house on Hester Lane, the careful conservative planning of someone maintaining a life already built, but the different kind of planning that happens when you are beginning rather than continuing, the kind that requires you to decide what you actually want before you can work out how to get it. She wanted to stay. This was the first and most certain thing, the thing she had known in the parking lot of the Greer motel when she had told Margaret she was going to go back and build something. She wanted to stay on this land, at the end of this track, in the clearing where her grandfather had built the shed and where her mother had stood at 20 with the chest between them and the mountains around them. She wanted to learn to use the tools. She called the woodworking school in Asheville that Helen Marsh had mentioned, a small school that taught traditional joinery and hand tool furniture making, and spoke to the director, a man named Paul, who was patient and specific in the way of people who love their subject and are always pleased when someone new is genuinely interested rather than casually curious. She explained what she had found and what she wanted to learn. He was quiet for a moment after she described the tools. The shoulder plane, he said. What maker? She looked at the plane. She read in the mark on the heel. He was quiet again, a different quality of quiet. Mrs. Bellamy, that plane hasn't been made since 1962. There are woodworkers in this country who have been looking for one in that condition for 20 years. A pause. You're welcome to come and learn. But I want you to understand that you may already know more than you think, based on what those tools have to teach. She signed up for the winter session, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, beginning in November. She would drive down from Greer on those days, an hour each way, through the mountain roads in whatever the November weather produced. Ray Cutler at the hardware store, when she told him what she had found and what she was planning, looked at her for a long moment, and then said that he had a friend who built cabins, small ones, the proper Appalachian kind, and that the friend's schedule was not full, and that he might be interested in a conversation if Dora was thinking about making the shed into something she could actually live in. She said she was thinking exactly that. The friend's name was Tom, and he came up Tabor Road on a Saturday with Ray and stood in the clearing and walked around the shed twice before he said anything. He was perhaps 60, with the look of someone who has spent a lot of time outdoors and has made his peace with all of its weather conditions. Foundation's good, he said. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. My grandfather. He looked at the shed. Wants a proper addition on the north end. Bedroom and a bathroom. Leave the original structure as the main room. Keep the workbench. Keep the floor. You don't touch that floor. He said this last part with the emphasis of someone stating a principle rather than making a suggestion. That floor is the reason you build around it, not over it. She had not told him about the floor specifically. He had seen it himself. What's the timeline? She said. Spring thaw to midsummer if we start planning now, he said. You'd be in by August. Ray looked at her. Where are you staying in the meantime? She told him about the air mattress and the lantern and the Dutch oven. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My sister has a room. In town. She rents to people she likes. He looked at Dora. I'll tell her you're coming. She did not know what she had done to be liked by a man she had met twice. But she was beginning to understand that Greer was a town that made its assessments quickly and that once it had made them, it acted on them without requiring a great deal of additional process. She was Viola's daughter. Viola had been assessed correctly a long time ago. The judgment had apparently been carried forward. She moved into Ray's sister's room at the beginning of November and began driving up Tabor Road every day that the weather permitted, which was most days because mountain weather in November was variable but rarely prevented a determined person in the right vehicle from getting where they needed to go. She worked in the shed in the mornings, learning the tools in the way you learn things by doing them rather than by being taught, which is to say imperfectly and with many failures, and with the specific satisfaction that comes when the imperfect attempts accumulate into something that begins to work. She began with the simplest thing Clarence's notebook contained, a small box, a lifting lid box with dovetailed corners, the same joint as the chest. She had watched the technique demonstrated twice in Paul's class in Asheville, and she had practiced on scrap wood for 2 weeks before she touched the walnut. The first attempt at the dovetail joint was unusable. The second was better. The third was something she could show Paul without embarrassment. By the 6th attempt, on a Tuesday evening in Ray's sister's kitchen with the tools laid out on a piece of canvas on the table, she cut a joint that fit with the specific tightness of a well-made dovetail. No gap, no force required. The surfaces meeting cleanly, the joint held by nothing but its own geometry. She sat and looked at it for a long time. She thought about her grandfather at his workbench in the shed, cutting the same joint by lamplight in the years before the rural electric lines reached this far into the hills. She thought about the chest in the shed, the dovetails at its corners, cut by the same hands that had sharpened the chisel she was holding. She thought about the 43 years between the last time anyone had used these tools and this Tuesday evening in a room above a hardware store in Greer. The town had noticed her by November. Small towns notice, which is one of their qualities and also one of their difficulties. And Greer was a small town that had been noticing things about its own people for long enough that the habit was well established. She was Viola's daughter, which opened a door. She was the woman who had bought materials from Ray's store and gone up Tabor Road alone and fixed the tin roof herself, which opened another door. She was also, people in Greer were beginning to understand, the woman who had been given a $4 shed and who was not behaving like someone who had been given a $4 shed. The people at the diner, where she ate lunch twice a week because the soup was good and because she liked the particular quality of a place where people came and talked without making an event of it, began to know her order. The librarian at the Greer Public Library, where she went on Thursday afternoons after her class in Asheville to use the research databases that the library's subscription gave her access to, began to set aside books she thought Dora might want. The woman who ran the post office told her, unprompted, the history of the Beaumont family in Cullen County, which was more extensive than Dora had known and which included details about Clarence that added depth to what she was building in her mind of the man whose tools she was learning to use. There were also people who were not welcoming. This was not surprising. She had lived 71 years and understood that welcome was never unanimous and that the people who were not welcoming often made their position known in the particular way of small towns, which was not confrontation, but rather the consistent quality of certain looks and the specific character of certain conversations that let you know you were being assessed and that the assessment had not yet come out in your favor. There was a man named Dillard who had a property on the lower section of Tabor Road, before the paved road ended, who had been farming the land adjacent to the track for 20 years and who had become, in the absence of anyone to object, accustomed to a certain use of the track that was technically a right-of-way, but that he had been treating as an extension of his own property. He had left equipment in the track twice in the week since Dora had been going up regularly. The first time she had gone around it through the field edge. The second time she had stopped and looked at it for a long moment, and then had driven to Dillard's house and knocked on the door and told him, with the specific directness of a woman who had recently lost her home to an unauthorized use of a legal document and who was not going to lose anything else to casual disregard of a property right, that the track was a right-of-way and that she would need it clear. He had looked at her in the way of a man who was accustomed to this kind of encounter ending in his favor. She had looked back in the way of a woman who was done. He had moved the equipment. There was a real estate agent in Greer named Carson who had appeared at the shed one afternoon in November in a car that had not been built for Tabor Road, and who had handed her a card and said that if she was ever thinking of selling, the land had become very attractive to certain buyers from Asheville and Charlotte who were looking for exactly this kind of property. He had said certain buyers in the tone of a man communicating that the buyers were both real and well-funded, the tone that was supposed to communicate that she would be fortunate to be considered. She had taken the card. She had thanked him. She had said she would keep it in mind. She had put it in the wood stove. She had not told anyone about this. But Ray had heard about Carson's visit through the particular mechanism by which small towns know about things, and he had come into the shed the following week with the expression of a man who is trying not to look satisfied and not entirely succeeding. Carson came up, he said. It was not a question. He did, she said. He's been after that land for 2 years, Ray said. Couldn't get anywhere because nobody knew who owned it. Now they do, Doris said. She was fitting a shelf bracket she had made from a piece of leftover pine, working with the marking gauge and the shoulder plane, and she did not stop working to have this conversation, which felt like the right way to have it. Ray watched her use the plane for a moment. You're getting better, he said. I'm getting practiced, she said. Better takes longer. He nodded. He looked around the shed, at the cleaned and organized workbench, at the furniture pieces now properly positioned in the space, at the figured walnut boards standing in the corner on their edge in the rack she had built for them, at the notebook of drawings on the shelf she had made, at the photograph of Viola and Clarence on the wall. What are you going to do with this place? He said. She set the plane down. She looked at the shed, at what it had become in the 6 weeks since she had first stood in its doorway with a flashlight. She looked at the walnut chest and the cherry table and the tools laid out with the organization her grandfather had established and that she had maintained because it was the correct organization, each tool in the place that made the next step of the work most efficient. She thought about the notebook of drawings, which had 37 designs in it, furniture pieces of various kinds, some simple, some elaborate, each drawn with the precision of a craftsman who understood that the drawing was the beginning of the thinking rather than the end of it. She thought about Paul in Asheville saying, "You may already know more than you think, based on what those tools have to teach." She thought about her mother writing, "You were always the one who could make something from very little." She thought about what it meant to be 71 years old with a $4 shed and her grandfather's tools and 37 furniture drawings, and the beginning of a skill she had not known she would need, in a clearing at the end of a mountain track in October. "I'm going to make furniture," she said. Ray was quiet for a moment. "Clarence's designs," he said. "His designs to start. My own eventually, maybe, but his first." She picked up the plane again. "There are 37 drawings in that notebook. I intend to make every one." Ray looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has made an assessment and is satisfied with it. "Tom says the edition will be ready by August," he said. "I know," she said. "So you'll be here." "I'll be here," Doris said. Outside, the November wind moved through the hardwoods and brought down the last of the leaves in a final settling. The trees going bare in the particular way of mountain trees in late autumn, the structure of them visible now beneath the season, clean and patient and already preparing for what came next. The addition was finished in late July. Tom had said August and beat his own estimate by 3 weeks. She moved in on a Friday with her 8 boxes and 4 suitcases, the same ones she had carried out of Hester Lane. She unpacked slowly. She put Gerald's clock on the windowsill. She put her mother's jewelry box on the dresser. She put the photograph of Viola and Clarence beside the workbench, where she would see it every time she worked. She made a fire in the wood stove, the first fire in her own home since the morning the movers came. She sat beside it with her tea and listened to the creak and the wind in the tulip poplar and the mountain evenings settling around the clearing, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that the dimensions of where she was matched the dimensions of who she was. She had sold 2 of Clarence's pieces in the spring. The cherry table to a collector in Asheville, the walnut chest to a museum in Raleigh that had been looking for exactly this kind of documented piece, and said so by the speed of their offer. The money had paid for the addition and the woodworking school in Asheville and the reserve that would carry her through the winter. She had made 8 pieces of her own by August. The last one was a writing desk in cherry, her own design, and she put it in the corner beneath the window where the morning light found it first. Patrice came in September. She stood in the clearing and looked at what her mother had built and said nothing for a long time. Inside, over coffee, she said, "I thought you needed to be taken care of." Dora said, "I needed to be trusted." "Those are different things." Patrice looked at her hands. "I was wrong," she said. It cost her to say it. Dora let it cost her. Then she said, "I want a relationship with you. But it has to be honest. That is the only condition." Patrice left in the late afternoon. Dora stood in the clearing and watched the car go. Then she went inside, put on her apron, and picked up her grandfather's chisel. She had 36 of his designs still to make. She set the blade to the wood and began. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.